Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I'm a fan of classic movies.
Hello and welcome to Overlapping Dialogue, a podcast of double features dedicated to programming the finest, most eclectic, and downright bizarre film pairings and cataloging the discussions that ensue. We're your gruesome twosome, Kyle and Levi Huffman. I'm Kyle.
I'm Levi.
And here we are.
Looking up pictures of the movie Too Late from 2015 with John Hawkes. Any thoughts?
Well, I was just saying that, that should be the name of a movie, Too Late.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, actually it is. And you were pulling up some, and of course it was, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But, yeah,
It's
I remember
an
you had
interesting movie,
conflicting ideas
Yeah,
about
maybe
it, right?
we might honestly do that on here someday, so I don't really want to say a whole lot about it. But
Keeping the cards close to the vest.
Too Late. Too Late.
Speaking of Too Late, Humanities,
Yeah.
Too Late in THX 1138.
I mean, THX 1138 kind of sounds like Too Late. THX 1138, Too Late.
Too Late Blacktop.
Too Late Blacktop. That was the sequel. You know, it's funny, I don't think there would have been a sequel to that because the movie implies that the car blows up at the end.
Monty Hellman was also
But,
kind of
yeah.
loosely a part of the USC crowd
Well, yeah,
that Lucas was a part of.
And
so.
part of the Corman machine because he had, made Cockfighter and... I don't remember if his movies, The Shooting and Ride in the Whirlwind or whatever it is, we saw that. I don't know if those were Corman movies technically, but they had Jack Nicholson and were kind of part of that.
They're definitely like a Jace.
Right, Jace.
Anyways. And also, though, Possessor from 2020, directed, of course, by Brandon Cronenberg, son of David.
David Cronenberg.
We're not going to have a Blue Plate special today because you just heard it recently. If you listen to our bonus episode, our bonus extravaganza.
Yeah, I feel like the way we
Blue
were
Plate
just talking
special.
a second ago about Roger Corman, it's like we literally yesterday recorded that episode,
Yeah.
so I feel like we're kind of just already in that mind space, and it seems like we're just picking up where we left off, but yeah.
That's where, and then also even with Lucas receiving his honorary Palme d'Or also. A lot of symmetry. Podcasting 2 consecutive days, man. Hard work, right? Not
Yeah.
really. People who do this professionally, I can't help but shake my head at and go,
Yeah.
okay, get a job.
Yeah.
As the song famously said.
Because we don't get paid for this, and we don't want to be either. I actually had a student ask me that this week. I said, "You get paid for that?" I was like, "No." And they were kind of like looking at me like I was dumb, and I was like, and I mean, this is a kid who's like, well, we're not going to talk about what his grades are.
We do all this, truly. I'm not even being sarcastic, for the love of the game. We just like doing it.
like if I could do this for nothing, you imagine what it would be like to actually get paid for it. Like, what a useless life you'd have to lead,
Episode
This is your
92.
job, and you don't really do anything else. And it's kind of like being a sportscaster. It's like, really? That's it? That's all you want to do, really?
Yeah.
Anyway, but whatever.
Again, episode 92. We're nearing that 100. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Special
we're getting there.
surprises in store now that we are in grade 4 coming up.
So we don't really have a prologue to get into today. This is probably going to be a shorter episode, obviously, because we just did that big Blue Plate special extravaganza. Listen to that if you haven't. That was a lot of fun to record.
Something we should do before we begin is to think about why. Do you think this was a good double feature, and why or why not? Of THX 1138.
Yeah,
and
I think
Possessor.
so. I mean, they're loosely, 50 years apart almost. THX 1138 came out in 1971.
It's come out in 2020.
2020, so they're nearly 50 years apart. I think it was because both kind of present horrifying sci-fi kind of versions of the future.
Right.
I think,
Although technically Possessor randomly was set in 2008, an alternate 2008, which is like why, but whatever. Anyway,
obviously, Possessor's working in a much more genre lens than THX 1138 is. Even though THX 1138, when it came out, as we're going to talk about, very clearly would have been tried to be sold as a part of another, like a larger movement in sci-fi around that time. Even though it's much more radical than anything else that was being made popularly. But I mean, they both are kind of terrifying and horrifying, both in their own ways. I think THX 1138 even more so, but I think it was a good choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think visually there's some similarities of like bald people running around and
that sounds like a letterbox like tag somebody used.
Bald people
running around. It's like a whole subgenre, you know. I'm Legend
Blue
in
Sunshine
there.
would be one. Yeah,
the Will Smith I'm Legend.
Right. 12 Monkeys, just everything.
It's a wide
the
genre.
Blue Man Group, whatever Blue Man Group concert films.
I'm not even saying this like in annoyance. Like, what's their deal? I actually want to look into what exactly the whole.
I mean, that was such
mission behind that.
That was such a 2000s product that most people have no memory of. That is weird because to me it seems like now that I'm on the other side of all that, it seems like it's like an amalgamation of like the world music boom of the 80s and 90s, a la like Paul Simon and Peter Gabriel, which a lot of people find the Graceland kind of stuff to be very controversial and like why are we calling it
appropriation,
blah, blah, blah.
I guess, and all
and
that.
Some people say that about Peter Gabriel too, but I feel like he always had a better handle on that from the beginning of admitting that, but also being like, no, but I actually do know a lot about world music and actually employing and working alongside a very international group of musicians and actually doing, actually having people that were really world musicians, right? But that mixed with like just the general like weird kind of like movement of the 2000s of stuff like Cirque du Soleil and like all these weird performance art that was going on that was like you see it in Myrtle Beach and then you forget about it, like and because I mean that was a big thing. I mean the Blue Man Group were like in Myrtle Beach all the time.
Yeah, I bet that was something that if I had to get started in New York or Vegas or something and then got franchised out.
What's great is we could just look all this up right now, but we don't know.
No, but we'll save that for our own personal time.
Right. But it feels like maybe they saw the movie Blue Sunshine and we're listening to Peter Gabriel at the same time and we're like, yo, what if we like paint ourselves blue and go bald and then we like do stuff? Are they still a thing?
Yeah, well, all right, we'll go through them a little bit here. Formed in 1987.
Interesting.
Performance art group, as it says, known for its stage productions, which incorporate many kinds of music and art, both popular and obscure. Its performers, known as Blue Men, have their skin
no way.
Yeah. They are mute during shows and always appear in groups of 3. Company has continuing shows in Berlin, Boston, Chicago, Las Vegas, and New York City.
Literally Berlin, that would be.
A typical production employs 7 to 9 full-time Blue Men who are selected by audition. I'm just now thinking of all these people driving to the Blue Men auditions and just covered in blue paint, just stopping
and
traffic
they're
lights.
like Dr. Manhattan or something too. That's another thing.
In addition to their stage shows, Blue Man Group has toured nationally and internationally, appearing on TV programs as characters and performers, releasing multiple studio albums, contributed to a number of film scores, and performed with orchestras around the United States.
You know what I need to do sometime this week is just watch a whole Blue Man Group performance to see what's going on there. But I feel like that really reached an apex in the 2000s. Maybe it's just me, but like...
That's probably when it became more well-known,
Well, also, I guess just based on the fact that they were in Myrtle Beach a lot, and we went to Myrtle Beach a lot at that time, that I'm just assuming that was why that was. I guess they're still a thing. I didn't even know that.
They are.
Yeah.
It looks like.
Anyways, but yeah, like, getting back to the double feature, interesting to have a Blue Man
Bald
Group discussion.
Man, yeah.
The bald people running around.
Yeah.
Bald people, as B-52s would say, running around.
I think, something about THX, perhaps in relation to Possessor, is to get into THX here in just a moment. Like, I feel like that movie was both very influential, but you don't see it in a very clear, direct way because of the influence of the other Lucas movies that followed are much more explicit and more commercial and popular with American Graffiti and, of course, Star Wars.
Right, that you're going to have either, like, Dazed and Confused and the Hangout movie or the teen Hangout movie in so many ways.
And the whole, like, American poetic, Graffiti. Like, the end of an era, turning of the page, and then, obviously, and Star Wars transforms
everything.
Blockbuster.
So, yeah, like...
but this has a very particular vibe that if you even get close to it, it's going to be obvious and clear that it's inspired by THX. Because I feel like, I do feel like a movie like American Graffiti has endured through the decades. But there are now so many other teen hangout movies that maybe sometimes, and I'm not even trying to bash the younger generations, but like it's easier for them to say, "Oh, I bet that looks like Dazed and Confused. That looks like Fast Times at Ridgemont High." Which is, that's a weird one because that's contemporary, and not like looking back on an era. But now we look back on it in the same lens as some of those other ones. But
but the way that movie's made, it feels like it's that kind of movie. And it's on, like, looking back, like, I think about the end of that movie a lot, where it's like showing all of the everything on the strip in LA, like closing down for the night, and it's turning all the lights off, and the Goodbye Goodbye by Oingo Boingo's playing, and that feels like it's like a
made like 10, 15 years later.
It's like, oh, this is what it used to be, and now it's over, kind of thing. But it was made then, like you said, it's weird. But yeah, and the same thing with like Dazed and Confused, like. I don't love that movie, but I would fault no one for feeling that way because that was that movie for that group of people in that era. And I have a lot of random bones to pick with that movie in particular, but about random things. It's a good movie. It's whatever, but like just random ideas about it. Like, I guess just to say quickly that with American Graffiti, it's like, am I going to go to college? I don't know. It's like, that's a pretty big life decision, right?
Yeah.
And Dazed and Confused, like, am I going to play football for high school next year?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's like,
that's Linklater in general has a much more casual view of things.
And so in that way, that fits his oeuvre, and that's acceptable overall. But it's just kind of like, okay, really, that's it? Like, but
to briefly get into the Linklater movie for a moment, like, I think one of the reasons the Before movies are so important and great to a lot of people, including us, is that it takes this very intimate relationship simply between two people and makes it feel like it's the most important thing you've ever seen. You know what I mean?
Yes, and also taking
he's so skillful at kind of taking slice of life and making
the European art cinema, I guess, approach to a story like that, but making it very Texan. Which those movies are very European, obviously anyway, because they're all in Europe. I think first one's Vienna, second one's Paris, and the third one's in Greece. And so, like, obviously that's like, Europe, but like taking a Texas view of that is very different. He makes all kinds of different movies. I mean, he's kind of hard to pin down.
Hitman's getting ready to come out. I know we didn't really mention that. I don't know if you know about that. That's the new Glenn Powell movie where it's like about a guy posing as a hitman or something.
Oh, I heard about that.
It's been getting good reviews. A lot of people said it should have been in theaters, but it's going to be coming out on Netflix.
Yeah, I have heard about that, but I forgot about it. Yeah, because I kind of ignored it. I remember seeing the list, and I kind of ignored it because I was like, I don't know what this is, and moved on. But yeah.
Let's go ahead and get into it because we got a lot more things to say. Here is the trailer for THX 1138.
All Earth Council, in its infinite wisdom, has decided these two numbers are to be disposed of. The Biochemical Forum has demands to make on their parts, however, before they are eliminated. That's the kind of efficiency that makes you proud to live in this era.
This series compared to 38.
You're overrunning again. Okay, just back off, THX 1138.
You have asked, are we happy? Are we happy and effective? Consultation with leading experts in the field makes it perfectly clear, that we are all now programmed for perfect happiness, perfect happiness, perfect happiness, perfect happiness.
1138, we're tracked.
Are you all right? What did they do to you?
There are, of course, occasional technical or electronic errors in programming and or surveillance which produce perverse exceptions.
I'm going to have a child.
First, they start skipping prescribed drug dosages. Then they begin touching, then indulging in various sexual acts, and the ultimate perversion, love. For such extreme psychobiological misfunction, only isolation will do. Despite rumors to the contrary, it should be made perfectly clear, perfectly clear, perfectly clear. There have been no, repeat, no unprogrammed departures, no pursuits. The shell people will attack any persons venturing beyond prescribed areas.
Wow, what a trailer. We had never seen that before.
Well, actually, I have years ago, but it's not one I think about a whole lot. And yeah, what's actually interesting about that trailer too is you have some footage of some stuff that isn't quite in the movie, or audio that's not in the movie. In particular, obviously, one of the big things about this movie, and we'll get to it later, is the main reason, the only way you can really watch it now is in the special edition version, which changes things, and the kind of the what do you call it, the shell people or whatever at the end of the movie look totally different, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's because he changed it. So that's something that we get to see in this trailer that you don't get to see in the regular movie, you know. But
right.
So THX 1138 is an American social science fiction film co-written and directed by George Lucas in his directorial debut, produced by Francis Ford Coppola, and co-written by Walter Murch, who would, of course, go on to be a big sound designer and editor in so many ways. Yeah, editor as well. That's another big thing. The film stars Robert Duvall and Donald Pleasance, with Don Pedro Colley, Maggie McOlmy, and Ian Wolfe in supporting roles. The film is set in a dystopian future in which the citizens are controlled by android police and mandatory use of drugs that suppress emotions. To quickly talk about the production a little bit, it was developed from Lucas's 1967 student film Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB, which he created while attending USC School of Cinematic Arts. The feature film was produced in a joint venture between Warner Brothers and American Zoetrope, which was, of course, Coppola's main company, which we're going to see people talking about again sometime in the coming future with Megalopolis. But the film received mixed reviews and from critics and underperformed at the box office upon its initial release, but has subsequently received critical acclaim, gaining a cult following, particularly in the aftermath of Lucas's success with Star Wars. 1977, a director's cut prepared by Lucas was released in 2004. This movie was made for $777,777,
which I think might have been a gimmick released budget for what it was.
Right, which it probably somewhere around that, but it made about $2.4 million, so it wasn't like a loss, but they saw it as a loss.
Well, Warner Brothers hated it, and it makes total sense why any studio would hate this movie. They'd be like, what is the commercial? Especially at a time we're going to talk about when there's a lot of these sci-fi movies that are really becoming these big pop hits.
Yeah.
And this has, compared to a lot of those movies, zero commercial appeal.
Yeah. Right.
Go on, I'm sorry.
Well, also just to say that, it was released March 11th, 1971. You have to remember this was 2 years before American Graffiti
Which was
would
a
come
huge
out.
hit.
Right. And this was, to talk about the production of this movie a little bit before we get into more general things, before we get specific again, that Yeah, it was the first film of a planned 7-picture slate commissioned by Warner Brothers from the 1969 incarnation of American zoetrope, primarily off of the fact that Coppola had been very successful in writing Patton, as well as...
Which he took as a total studio job. He didn't really like it all that much.
Making The Rain People, and various other movies that he had made that had been a success for him. And it was kind of, American zoetrope in general, you could even speak more about than me, knowing a little more about it, was supposed to be this kind of very large conglomeration, kind of independent conglomeration of filmmakers that were more, experimental or bohemian, artistically minded, bohemian, that was very much a part of the new Hollywood movement early on.
To talk about Coppola a little bit, because...
That came out of the USC and San Francisco kind of
collective area, yeah, and so... We're going to mostly be talking about Lucas with this, but Coppola plays a pretty big part in a lot of this because he came from a more theater background. He was part of theater in college, and if you know anything about the productions of his movies and how he rehearses with actors and directs actors, it's much more from a comparable to a theater background than it is to movies. Because I think in particular the experience of The Rain People, which we really like.
Yes,
we only saw that a few years ago. We might have even talked about it on the pod in passing. I don't even remember.
That came out in '69.
Yeah, so. That was a movie that, again, Coppola had spent a little bit of time with Corman, as we said, or talked about a little bit yesterday with Dimension 13 and some of the other small productions he did. He might have even made some softcore pornography. I can't even remember.
Coppola?
Maybe, yeah. I can't quite remember that.
Yeah.
But anyways, the experience of The Rain People really transformed his vision of filmmaking, where he said, wait a minute, because that movie's essentially is a road movie in the narrative, but it was also a road movie in its production, that they went across all these different places, and that was kind of this big light bulb moment for Coppola, who said, hey, wait a minute, why don't we totally break away from the Hollywood system, which is already in the process of dying, as we know, by the mid to late 60s. And
just to say, he wrote a film called The Peeper.
Maybe that's what I'm
which kind of was
of.
made into, and then he also made a movie called Tonight for Sure, which was softcore pornography. Yeah, and then he would go on to, like I said, work with Corman. But
Coppola, that is, basically said, why don't we just totally do our own thing? I don't think he was talking about the term electronic cinema as much back then as much as he was by the mid to late 70s. But the whole idea that we're just going to totally do our own thing, and all that sounds great when you're young and but to find the space for a studio, to find the scripts that are going to turn into something that's meaningful, was obviously the struggle.
Yeah.
So much so that, it was around this time where there were lots of various projects up in the air. That was one of the reasons, some of the insecurity of all that was one of the reasons why Coppola took on The Godfather in the first place, was to cover Zoetrope's already massive debts, because he also saw a big part of their independence was, we own the equipment, we own the cameras, we own the lights, we own everything, and we are going to be able to dictate what we want to do. And when that was kind of starting to go slightly sideways, he was like, well, and Lucas, actually, to bring him into this, was someone who, I think it was The Rain People, it might have been something else, basically interned on Coppola's set. That was kind of because he had made some movies that got the attention of people when he was at USC, Lucas that was, including the short film. Have you seen the short film for THX that eventually served as the inspiration for this?
Yeah, it's been a long time
It's
ago.
Been a while since I've seen it too.
I did it when I wrote that paper about all this.
But anyways, Lucas, he basically earned an internship to work under Coppola, and they fell in love with each other. And
he was, I think, second unit on The Rain People. Is that
right?
I
think that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, and he kind of interned under him, and he basically Coppola was pushing him. All right, well, you need to do your own stuff, and I'll help produce it. And they were going to be the two big, producers. And again, there was a lot of other filmmakers from the USC kind of area that, like we said earlier, Walter Murch, Monty Hellman. Spielberg was a little bit adjacent to this. I think he went to UCLA, and he was a little younger than them, so he was slightly behind them in terms of where he was. But the whole idea was, we're going to totally be this bohemian, hippie film collective, and we're going to make the movies that Hollywood's too afraid to make. And part of the subversive nature of what THX become was indeed the idea that this is going to be funded by Warner Brothers, or partially, but made by THX, and that if it was a success, that was going to set up THX in this meaningful way. One of the things, weirdly, that brought about the end of THX, other than Coppola's kind of maniacal, and I say this with mostly respect and awe, self-destructive nature of the way he just made movies back then, was weirdly the success that both of them had. Godfather was, obviously highest grossing movie of all time, won all the Academy Awards. Yeah. Deep down, Coppola always kind of resented certain aspects about The Godfather, even though, again, it's now inextricably linked with his legacy. And so he wanted to, in the immediate aftermath of The Godfather, and one of the only reasons he signed up to do Godfather Part 2 was to set himself up for being able to do The Conversation very quickly, which was a much more of a Zoetrope production, and then eventually set the stage. And Apocalypse Now was this other movie that was kind of in various stages of development. That was something that originally Miles and Lucas were planning on doing. And this just blows my mind. They actually were wanting to take 16mm cameras and go and film Apocalypse Now in the midst of the war itself, which Lucas later admitted was insane and would not have worked. Yeah. And Miles was another one of these guys that was obviously part of that. But weirdly, one of the things that kind of brought about the end of American Zoetrope was at once the success that everybody got, and that they kind of said, oh, well, I can kind of make these movies slightly out of the Zoetrope thing.
Yeah.
And Coppola was always slightly more committed to it because it was more his baby than Lucas's. Lucas, again, due to the, and I might be jumping ahead here, but due to the kind of not all that success of this movie, Coppola said, you need to make something that's more commercial. I'm sorry, I love this, but you need to do something that's going. And so he's like, all right, fine, I'll do what I know. And he did American Graffiti, that then set the stage for Star Wars, which of course totally changed Lucas's life, most especially in terms of the independence he was going to be able to have to do whatever it is exactly the last.
We're going to do what we want to do. Yeah.
We'll be free when we get loaded. The next 45 years, which is a conversation we can maybe have later. But I know that's a lot of context to sort through. And so America Zoetrope, I think, for those two artists for this time period in the New Hollywood era, represents a very strange blip in the system, both for sci-fi and for New Hollywood, because it's a movie that is more a part of origin story territory than it is seen as its own fully fledged film, which was one of the reasons I think we wanted to pick this, because
I try to view it as that as much as possible.
Because, of course, we love American Graffiti, and, of course, we love Star Wars, the original most especially. But then there's this, and it's like...
And I think, and you're right, because I think people do view it as an origin story of sorts, but this movie is so incendiary, I find it hard to view it as that, because it is so itself.
Because a movie like this, and to a lesser extent, something like Reservoir Dogs, because Reservoir Dogs was popular enough and is still very popular.
Yes.
But a lot of the, something like THX 1138 or Reservoir Dogs, or these very early films from directors who later made it big, are usually only started to be seen by people after the hits come. And then they're like, oh, what did they do before that? Because this movie made okay money, but for a lot of people who know who George Lucas is, it would not be seen until after American Graffiti or most especially Star Wars.
And interestingly, this movie was re-released after Star Wars, that Warner Brothers felt they wanted to make a little money on it.
I'm sure he shook his head.
And it still didn't make money, even after that.
They're like, where's the Wookiees? Where's the TIE Fighters?
No, but the movie still didn't make money, which I think speaks to...
It's still incredibly radical and not... because the movies got weirdly softer. Because THX 1138 is very much the movie of an angry young man, I feel like, who's looking at the world and saying, this is disgusting. Why are we making the world into this? American Graffiti's like, remember when things were softer and it was only 11 years in the past, but it was still felt like a softer world. Then Star Wars is even more romantic and nostalgic for the very Flash Gordon that opens this movie in terms of, let's go back to almost like knights and queens and princesses and this almost like medieval fantasy sci-fi thing that, of course, America and the world was starved for in the 70s. And I think that's obviously not to talk too much about Star Wars here, but one of the reasons it was such a hit was because, and we live in a world that has been inundated with Star Wars, so it's really hard to time travel back to understand why that movie was so big, was because it was this bold, new, fresh piece of the past. And so this is a bold, fresh, angry piece of the future. And we, 50 years removed, it's easy to look at THX 1130 and it says, it's about today. And it's like, well, it is about the future he sees, but it's also about the present of what the 70s felt like to him and to a lot of other people, which is, we've talked about before, that need not be lost on movies that were about a future or predicting things. And, they're about today. Well, yeah, kind of, but actually it was about the early 70s and how the early 70s felt to a lot of people.
And I want to talk about that specifically.
I'm sure that was all over the place, everything I just said. But
no, you're right on all that. I think that, but I want to talk about that specifically in a moment as far as what the 70s was of that. But I think first we need to talk about science fiction before this time, and that might be very general, but and I know you've done a lot of talking, but I'll ask you first to see kind of what your opinion is on this. What do you think about science fiction, I guess, pre-60s, ultimately? Because obviously, you had in the 60s this ramping up of the space race, which would culminate in 1969, obviously, with the moon landing. And
any child, especially who grew up in the 60s, that was this soundtrack to their whole lives, whereas when we're going to get there, and then the whole nuclear war, how that fits in all that. I mean, that was instrumental of any child who grew up during
and
that
so
period,
in the 50s, post-World War II, you'd had in the 1950s especially, because, I don't really know of very many 1940s space movies. There aren't very many, and they would be very late, I'm sure. There were honestly more in the 30s than there were in the 40s, which I find interesting. I don't know what the answer to that
Things
is,
to Come, that was
in the 30s.
Yeah, 30s, I remember. Yeah.
But so science fiction actually kind of took a break for World War II, basically. But
there's probably, and I do agree with that. There's probably some really random, interesting things that exist that we're not super aware of.
Of course, it's okay. So stupid, duh. With Star Wars, you had the Flash Gordon serials, and it feels like that science fiction went in
Duck Dodgers, but
it went in that direction of movie serials rather than like big productions of like actual science fiction films, But you had the B movies of and alien movies of the 50s, which were big. But then in the 60s, you had ultimately kind of the 1-2 punch of Planet of the Apes in 2001.
Before even getting to that, it should be said that I feel like Forbidden Planet is this bridge, of sorts. But because that movie was not super taken seriously when it came out. But it was like
Shakespeare.
But it was like Shakespeare meets space, and and it was like, we're gonna take this elevated. Not exactly. I mean, the movie doesn't like quote from Shakespeare at length that I remember, but like highbrow, material, and like put with it this very fantastical thing. And I haven't seen that movie in a while. I actually bought the Blu-ray. I know you'd already had one. I've been wanting to rewatch it for a while, but I feel like that's kind of a bridge.
Yeah.
But as you just said, the 1-2 punch that it was massive of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes, which we've talked at length about before, that definitely represented a turning of the page in sci-fi on screen as being something that is going to be made by a major studio with major budgets. And, certainly with a director of the, Kubrick is not exactly what we know him to be today, but he had a growing reputation even by that point.
Yeah.
That's going to be taken more seriously.
Right. Well, to go
in
back
a social context, or also the unimaginable abyss and horror of what space is in 2001.
Well, and then also that similarly in the 60s, too, you had the Twilight Zone taking on. So it seems like, science fiction actually kind of... in these weird periods of the 40s and the 60s, kind of took on this random serialized form, which is ultimately what it actually always was in comic books or in
novels,
science fiction literature. And interestingly, Forbidden Planet actually, once again, even though it's based on Shakespeare, is actually taking these very, like you said, highbrow and philosophical ideas of what you would find in like Lovecraft or Campbell, who wrote not the Campbell of Star Wars fame of that he was a big
Campbell,
fan of, the Thing from who goes there.
There's also all that 50s creature feature sci-fi horror. I
that's
guess
what I'm saying. So but interestingly, in the cinema for the most part until the 60s, you had science fiction in movie theaters. In that sense, was a lot more dumbed down and a lot more like you got this monster on the loose and it's caused by nuclear war and it's this, and of course you had Godzilla and like all these things that came out of that were a lot more basic. But then with Forbidden Planet, I mean, you literally have ideas about like this man's mind is creating a monster that cannot be seen, and it's all about the evil of
more
the
abstract,
mind, right?
yeah.
And that is like something that is so weird.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, I'm assuming, I can't remember everything about The Tempest, but I have a feeling there's some element of that in there somewhere, although there was the Caliban monster, which actually was like a monster.
Yeah.
But I think there is some element of that there too, but that ultimately it's like someone's own mind is the enemy, right?
Yeah.
And which is weird because you had all those like Brain movies of the 50s and 60s, like Brain from Planet Arrow's terrible movie.
Levi does the Lord's work of watching a lot of these movies that I'll probably never see.
Well, I don't know if it's the Lord's work, but yeah, Fiend Without a Face, like a lot of those movies that were these like killer brain movies, right?
It's just such a random phenomenon.
And then you had kind of a phenomenon of that once again in the 80s. You had some like that, like The Brain was a movie.
Well, you got that. Obviously, it's a comedy, but The Man with Two Brains, the Steve
Man
Martin
with Two Brains,
movie.
and then also even Brain Dead, which is kind of a different movie, but but yeah, like anyway, we're kind of going in circles.
Even
here,
weirdly,
but,
They Live is
right,
kind of it's more of an
Reanimator also, which Reanimator's that's H.P. Lovecraft, but that's also kind of like a Frankenstein riff anyway. But anyway, all this being said, it feels like there was a lot of kind of tiptoeing around those ideas of science fiction that I feel like with really the 60s boom of it, and then especially even into the 70s, you had seen science fiction take on this more literary context that it originally had in literature.
Even somebody like even looking at like 2001, that's like kind of co-created and conceived with Arthur C. Clarke, who was a huge writer in the sci-fi realm.
And you had had Dune being written in that decade. You had Frank Herbert's whole worldview of science fiction. You also had, even before that in the 50s, with horror and science fiction, the EC comics of weird fantasy and Tales from the Crypt obviously being a lot more science fiction.
I mean, you could even go also talking about the growth of Marvel in the 60s.
Yes.
Marvel Comics, and how much of that is sci-fi based, much more sci-fi based than even the DC stuff before that
and
was.
even taking
radioactive this, radioactive that.
Political ideas, and the X-Men basically being about civil rights. I mean, so that's what I'm saying. It's like science fiction weirdly took a couple off decades in the 40s and 50s of being just purely adventure or shock cinema in its own way.
Obviously, I think, I think a lot of that social context you're talking about, maybe film noir, filled that role during that time.
Because science fiction is always viewed in this realm
then Blade
of
Runner's the ultimate combination of film noir and sci-fi in the 80s.
And it's not actually about a whole lot.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that movie eventually, I'm sure. But I was actually thinking about that. Maybe we're saying too much of maybe doing that and the sequel on here at some point, because I have a lot of thoughts about both those movies. Especially because I've been playing Cyberpunk 2077, which is an amazing game, by the way. But
the whole debate we'll have to have whenever we do Blade Runner is going to be like, what version do we like? The final cut, the director's
I always
cut,
watch
the European work print, like whatever.
I always watch the director's cut personally. I feel like that's the best one I've seen. But anyway, that science fiction is supposed to always be this very social and probing and revelatory work.
But before that, it was
you know,
seen in almost purely lowbrow
right.
form.
And so this movie, in the context of all that, I feel like is and I say this without hyperbole, truly, and with as much emphasis as possible, one of the most radical and acerbic and angry and in many ways emotionally and physically violent science fiction films that I've ever seen produced by Hollywood.
And also
in a pretty non-independent context. I mean, it made in an independent sphere, but released by a studio that is like Warner Brothers, you know.
We've been talking a lot about it in context of sci-fi.
Yeah.
I want to talk about it a little bit in context of New Hollywood, because that's also a whole other thing that's going on during this time. We've talked about it at length at various times on here. You know, it's said about New Hollywood a lot. It's like, oh, it's taking the European sensibilities and putting it in an American context.
Yes.
Something like a movie we did in the past and we love, 5 Easy Pieces. That's stylistically a pretty straightforward, not that crazy,
not narrative,
chaotic movie.
But,
I mean, the emotions and the acting behind it are very raw, but I mean, it's not like hard to understand.
Well,
exactly.
the narrative in the sense of for that time was groundbreaking because it's the kind of I guess change in scenery and also the ending of the movie by just saying whatever. It's a very Don Draper moment, you know. But anyway, yeah.
And then even something like Wild Bunches, which is also, it should be said, taking a genre movie in the Western and doing almost like a punk rock take on it. That does feel a little more extreme in terms of obviously the style. As far as the narrative, it actually is not that crazy different than a lot of other Westerns that had been made, but it's how the movie looks and feels. It's what feels like a heart attack or feel like an assault on yourself. This, because a lot of these, they're like Godardian or True Fun. This actually feels like an American Godard movie,
and I think,
I don't mean that it's that much better or worse than anything else that was being made, because I think there are other New Hollywood movies that are superior to this movie that are stylistically more, quote, conventional.
Yeah,
but this movie just feels raw and extreme in a way that most of the New Hollywood movies, for all that's said and done, do not. I think the only other filmmaker that has had a pretty big amount of success that's in any way comparable as some of the movies of Altman during this period are also do
maybe
feel like
Images
they're,
or
something like that. Especially that's the movie I was thinking of. Feels transgressive in a real way, because something like I love him, Hal Ashby, a movie like say Harold and Maude. Like that's a movie that, especially early on in it, feels like you're watching something you shouldn't be seeing and transgressive. And I say this actually credit to the movie, because I think this is great. It actually ends at a happy place, in a place of kind of a sort of a reconciliation that's taking place. And so for all the extremity of the movie, it still ends on a happier
and
note.
I think of what you're getting at here is by essentially saying that most of these movies had some sort of human aspect to them. Yeah, that this movie is not only is absent, but is in no way
I feel like it's
interested
like
in
approaching someone almost conceiving of their humanity, and in that is innately rebelling against a society that is trying to rid one of one's humanity.
And over the time you see that he's changing, but we don't get this internal monologue that other movies would have. I think that's what you're saying and getting at is that this movie more than others feels so removed and isolated from all these others because of, like I said, that emotional detachment that he feels people are smart enough to recognize is the whole point of the movie. Of course, that audiences did not.
This was something that was written about around this time of the, quote, downer ending.
Yeah.
The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Easy Rider, a lot of these like New Hollywood classics. When I think about like the ending of Bonnie and Clyde, obviously they get shot up and killed, and
I
it's
think
very
Thieves Like
raw
Us is an even more, in certain ways, bracing version of that, because in Bonnie and Clyde there's no one left.
Well, what I was going to say is,
like,
even in the movie that's a downer ending,
yeah,
there's the moment before they both die where there's those quick cuts of them like exchanging glances, and there's a weird romantic intimacy in that of like, well,
like the
we're
ending
gonna
of
die.
Thelma and Louise would be later.
Like we're gonna die, but we're gonna do this together.
Yeah,
and for all the downer, sad ending that it is, there is a weird, romantic, beautiful, weird quality to it. This is like, I'm in this all by myself. Like obviously, I did have this pseudo relationship, but I'm totally. I mean, this is the most George Lucas thing ever, because if you know his whole conception of I'm going to do things my way and I'm going to just totally be my own person, and you even look about some of the characterizations and how everyone in a version of the main American Graffiti characters, they're all like, I'm going to go and do things my way, even if I'm a friend of yours. I'm going to go. Yeah,
because that's the whole point of the movie, is that for him, in that, we've talked a lot about American Graffiti on this podcast, obviously, but it's almost like it's totally great, and we keep coming back to it.
That sounds bad. I just now remembered that we actually did that.
I know, that's what I'm saying. It was our
Yeah.
second one. But yeah, with that, yeah, because that whole movie's kind of about, we need to spend this last night together, but literally all of them are apart, leading their own lives, and that George Lucas sees his own, like, he sees the success of self-discovery to truly be of the self, and about, I'm going to do this like I said, my way, and I need to lead my own life and do things this way, and
even take that to the very ending of the original Star Wars. Even like Luke, I'm not gonna use my targeting computer. I'm gonna tap into the Force, and Obi-Wan in this wisdom beyond what the world is offering me into something greater, and that I don't need my targeting computer. I'm gonna use the Force and do it myself. Even that, in a weird way, is an expression
and sometimes
of this, like,
something I never thought about, because we've always assumed, I think, when you have and this is getting into Star Wars too specifically, but it's funny how we're always like, no, we can't do that, but
that might be deep down a break in case of emergency aspect of this pod that will eventually cross that bridge.
The voiceover of Obi-Wan saying, use the Force, Luke, and then let go, Luke, and then at the end of him after that saying the Force will be with you always, is that I think we've always as a society assumed that that's him speaking to him in that moment. But in a certain way, you could even think of it as that's literally just his memory of him telling him that. You know, and even going on what you're saying, of that he's using the memory, not the person, to self-determination, right?
Star Wars is always, as a movie, 10 times better if you really just look at it as a single film, which is impossible. We all know now, but I mean, it's so much of the power of that movie is. Yeah, well, if you put it even in like the original trilogy, it still is obviously amazing. But the further we get away from it,
just as an
the
example,
more it's watered down in terms of the power of that.
To think about the use
movie.
of old, forms. I mean, even just taking the idea of, instead of showing the massacre of his aunt and uncle, is that you have him come back like in the Searchers, literally, and find everything the way it is, and the music in that scene, and his facial expression, and just all that. That's just one of the most well edited scenes in any movie, anyway. But like, just everything about that is so flawless, and that can all be done. Like, a whole story is told in about 60 seconds of runtime, and that you can do that way. And because I mean, when I talked about screenwriting a little bit with my film club students, I showed the first 15 minutes of Star Wars and was like, this is how you open a movie, literally bang bang bang, like everything in that is so flawless, so genius. Which goes to show, isn't it fascinating that someone like that can make a movie so unapproachable as THX in that way?
That's the context to scratch your head at about this movie. Was THX 1138 truly who he always was, and that he had to, quote, sell out or, quote, water himself down? Or was that the seed that eventually takes him to do what Star Wars is? And it can, I guess, the reality is it can kind of be both of those things. It's not necessarily one or the other. To dig into this movie a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, because I want to talk about this movie a little more specifically. You go ahead.
Again, as I said, when you just look at it at the landscape of the other New Hollywood movies, and certainly the sci-fi movies of this era, which a lot of them are approaching things from also a nihilistic thing. Because a movie like Planet of the Apes is not New Hollywood exactly. However, it's like a degree or two removed in about the time period, and has that sort of a nihilism that sci-fi was very much tapping into, that just was culturally what sold back then, because that's what people felt back then. And so, again, this movie, to be as dark as it is, and I don't know if we want to jump to the end exactly, but does this movie, quote, give you more hope about humanity in terms of how it ends? Or, like, do you think that, like, what do you think he's trying to, above all else, communicate with this? Because, interestingly, in the trailer that you wasn't able to hear, you hear in the audio, it says what does it say? A love story shot on location in the 21st century.
Right.
Which seems like an ironic touch, obviously, because it's like, that's
And
not
I don't
how
know
we
if that was
perceive love
his.
stories
I don't
to
know
be.
if that was his decision to
Yeah.
call that or not. Probably not. I'm
Yeah.
assuming that was Warner Brothers. In the marketing.
Like what? We talked about the darkness of this movie, like just scene to scene, moment to moment, and then looking at it in the grand sum total of what it is. Like, how does this movie make you feel above all else? Because I feel like that's more about what this movie's about than
that's
about
what it is.
like quote characters.
You know what I remember more about the ending, which is the most hopeful thing about the movie. I don't remember the fact that he is now free in the world to find and that's a very self-determining, idea of what Lucas believes too. Is like, well, no matter what, I'm going to know the truth, or no matter what, this is my destiny, that sort of thing. But you know what I remember more about the ending is the fact that the police force says, well, we're about to go over budget on this pursuit, and so we need to stop it, because if we spend too much money, that's bad. So we don't really care what happens to this person anymore. We're literally going to give up.
You are such an outlaw. You have exceeded the state's budgets of your enslavement, basically, is what that's saying. We can even talk about the cops in this, too, which are these purely dehumanistic, like, robotic, hateful machines that are also at times playing with children, or like kind of like, and they got these weird accents and voices.
And in its own way, that's I think, and I don't want to be too political about this, but the movie's political. I mean, that's its own reflection of what police officers are in their own way.
We saw that
anyway.
in RoboCop too,
right? That it's this like, in a lot of ways, faux sincerity or protect the innocent, with this like savage violence that's at the heart of what it has to be somebody like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I don't want to label that entirely, but of questioning that in that sense, but also by viewing it in the sense of that was very, like you said, of particular to that present moment of what police officers were in 1971 to the left. Was literally a fascistic group of
agents
people.
of violence,
and you had seen, I mean, literally in the because when I think of cops of the 60s, I don't think of like what they really were, which is still the same, wearing the caps or the pointed caps and all that. I see riot gear. That's what I think of.
Like the different protests of the civil rights movement,
and so that is what this looks like. They're wearing
of like 1968 with
like,
the Democratic National Convention with billy clubs and, like you said, riot gear.
And they're all in leather and dressed in black. I mean, they've got batons and right. But I'm saying of these characters, the police in this. But and them using literally like shock prods and stuff that looks very futuristic, but is actually pretty like basic and very low level. And yeah, just that that ultimately, getting back to what I was saying about the ending, I mean, there's a hopefulness of, now he's going to know the truth, but also knowing that only this is possible because the government gave up and said, we don't want to spend more money on this.
And part of that is also the realization on their part that not everybody's going to even go through
to this point.
Get to this
and it's
point.
Almost a very sad, kind of somber respect for the person to say, wow, they really went all the way. Well, whatever, we're not going to, and because that's what the cop says when he's like climbing up the ladder, and the cop's looking up at him and says, come back. Like, the way the cop's he's like, we can't help you out there, or something. I don't remember what it says. Basically saying, you're not going to have our protection from the outside world anymore.
And it's kind of ambiguous of whether or not there's been a nuclear war or something on the outside of the world.
And that feels like a very Alan Moore statement, too, in the sense of, well, the police are protecting you, or this society is protecting you, this fascist society is protecting you from the outside world, and saying by the end, well, I don't care what that means because I want to be free, literally. And that's ultimately actually maybe the most hippie New Hollywood statement comes in the form of this, of like, because it's even saying, no, we're going to be successful at that. Something like Easy Rider, they're already free the whole movie, and that they are gunned down by the end of the movie, you know, or even Bonnie and Clyde, another version of that. Like, it always coming to some form of ruin. Whereas this movie's actually radical enough to say, no, he is going to get away, but then what becomes of that is its own, actually hopeful, I think a pretty hopeful ending, but
unexpectedly,
right, but also very transgressive in the sense of, well, what is this, the way the world literally looks.
He's going to become his own star child, like, like whatever the ending of 2001 exactly means. And I say that out of total awe and respect.
I don't know. But that standing in front of the sunrise, and it's just this, you know, blood red orange, like wasteland looking, almost like Mad Max looking, you know, of the outside
in a weird
world.
way, I think this has been pointed out that in some ways visually, the twin suns, when Luke looks at the twin suns in the original Star Wars, echoes like this. I don't know what's beyond here, but I see the sun, and I see that there's a world beyond the one that I'm in now, and that's its own way of quotation or a
because that might even be the strongest moment of the original Star Wars, is that of saying, I want to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because he, like we always say,
people
farmer. Talk about he literally farms water. And people talk about, oh, he's so dumb. It's like, he literally gets moisture out of the air. I mean, yeah, and that's a very Dune thing too, you know, but it's funny because in Dune it seems like everybody is a genius all the time, which is its own. Michelangelo is a genius.
We can,
but anyway,
I think another thing to talk about too with THX is what the day-to-day life of the world of this movie is.
Getting back to the way it makes us feel, I guess, because we never totally answered that. What do you want to say on that?
Well, just how isolating it is in the midst of walking around all these other people. I think there's a conversation to be had that I feel like has been had, but maybe in even a more of a, not to move it to the modern day exactly, but how pharmaceutical drugs are used in this movie as a way to dull one's emotions.
And that comes out of the post-war boom of pharmaceuticals and medicine anyway, about how doctors are just like, here, take medicine, I don't want to have to deal with you, and that leading to
and I feel like
all those
now we
issues
do
at that
have
time.
more awareness of, but is its own problem now over medication, and particularly there's a lot of conversations that can obviously be had about mental health and
I feel like that actually was a bigger problem then, in the sense of that was literally the answer to every problem.
Yeah.
Now there's somewhere in the middle, and it's more holistic. But
I mean, it's more. You know, I feel like we have a little bit more awareness about that stuff now, even for the problems of today.
Well, now what I will say is what you're right about is in the general consensus of society. I think mental health is this whole buzzword that's talked about in such this strange, ridiculous, hyperbolic way that people who are actually doctors and actually psychologists have a pretty firm holistic understanding over what that is. But like average everyday people, oh, I'm anxious, I'm depressed. Like, are you really though, or is that you just saying that to get whatever you want,
to get your emotions dulled, or to get that medication?
Yes.
Or whatever,
So yes, I think you're right about that. But
there's also, you could talk about the television of this era, what it looks like, about these, like, it's A, pornographic, or B, violent, and, you know, the pornography and violence. And obviously in the early 70s, pornography was becoming even more publicly available, and certainly in movie theaters, even too.
Yeah.
And then obviously all the violent media, and you didn't even have to, you know, you could go see Dirty Harry, or you could turn on the news. I mean, either way, it was like you're going to be seeing something pretty violent back then, you know.
In that, even in the sense of the pornography thing, that I think what makes this movie so bracing is that it just employs the imagery. It doesn't take time to give you a breath to say
Yeah, right.
or say anything about it,
Or
other than
explain
just
the
show
context
it.
of
But
it,
there's the scene where he comes back home from work and is literally sitting there, basically being masturbated by this like some sort of suction machine, while he's watching pornography, literally on the hologram. And that then his female roommate is literally in the other room just like preparing their dinner while all this is going on. And all this is said without words, like I said. And I think that's what makes the movie so effective, is it's literally in your face, like this is what this world is, and the utter disgust that one feels when watching that. You know,
it should be mentioned too. We haven't mentioned it once and we've done this movie on the pod, that Clockwork Orange came out this very same year and is in some ways about some of these same ideas. Another thing you could even talk about is the way prison is depicted in this movie, as these big white spaces that I can't help but think of alone in SpongeBob, and how alienating it is, how abstract it is, and how it's almost to me 10 times more terrifying than being behind these steel bars that you can see in front of you. It's this open-ended. I feel like I could walk 6 miles in one direction and not be out of whatever this is. You know,
it's sensory deprivation too. I mean, which is its own torture. Maybe
that's another thing unconsciously too that I didn't even think about with this movie, and I think you maybe just hit on it, is the lack of color and life in this movie.
It's very cool and gray.
Because you think about a lot of the other sci-fi movies this time, they really play on colorful effects or set pieces or whatnot, and just a lot of this movie just feels like it's in white and just
it always feels numbers and like the most colorful stuff in the movie, the computers that you see from like and that's so genius too, the way he shoots the you don't ever really get to see any of the people who are above all this, you know, all the like the rich or the people in control. That there's those moments when he's being tortured in the prison by, and I feel like that's the most like specifically fascistic or Nazi imagery or ideas in the whole movie, is in that scene where they're literally pressing buttons. There's this console and you see all these lights and stuff, and they're literally basically just pressing buttons of saying, what if we turn this up to this? Will it make his body do this or that? And literally it's like torturing him. And the way that the men are talking about it are just like, well, hang on, you don't need to do that much. And they're very like, it's like it's a job to them, and they're literally torturing this person. And that I think about, it sticks in my mind a lot, of like being one of the most appropriate exemplifications of fascism, especially in a 60s or 70s context.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest would be a few years after this that for a lot of people I think would come to be representative of the blurry line between mental health and prison, and how those two things can unfortunately interact with each other.
And so all this is, and I mean the opening of this movie too is edited in such a way that it basically is putting together scenes from the movie itself, and you're not really sure what you're looking at. And so the movie even begins with this like uncertainty of like, I don't even know what I'm entering into, like, and we talked about it last time about how the movie opens with this like Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers, I think it's Buck Rogers actually, kind of serial trailer, and then it's basically saying this is what we thought the future was. Well, now here it is. And I mean, it's like the future is here is the tagline of the movie, and it ultimately saying this is what you think it's going to be, but actually it's going to be a lot more boring and dull and violent and oppressive. One thing we can talk about too, since I'm seeing the image of it, what do you think about the religious aspect of this movie, and maybe that being tied to Lucas's very complex relationship to religion in general?
Well, yeah, in this movie, I feel like, because there's a scene where Duvall, as THX 1138, goes to it's almost like a public confessional booth, and you see this image, particularly it's the image of Christ gives his blessing from 1478. It's from artist Hans Memling. As it says here, is used as the visual representation of the state-sanctioned deity OMM 000. I do feel like it's a, I do agree Lucas has a complicated view of religion. In this movie, it's almost used, religion is state-sanctioned, state-controlled. Yeah. And in the context of this movie and thinking about how religion is often used as this opiate to the masses to get people to do what you want, I can't help but say, well, I understand this. I'm glad that this was not his only take on religion, because I think religion in general is obviously a more complex thing than just simply saying that.
And I mean, the Force obviously being
a tool of liberation,
totally religious aspect of those movies. Yeah.
I think he's described himself routinely as a Buddhist Methodist, which I think he was raised as kind of in a Christian Methodist tradition, but then he's obviously, especially in the 60s and 70s, come to be not totally influenced by, but a little more influenced by Eastern thought and religion.
Which is what the Force ultimately is, more of a Eastern or Buddhist than a Christian one.
But anyways, I do feel like in this movie it is pretty clearly almost a cynical look at religion as a way to... And again, I can see, as a Christian living in the year 2024, I can't help but look at a lot of my other fellow Christians and see the criticism is still standing in terms of something
I don't
that's
think
a problem.
I don't think it's totally saying that Christianity or religion are evil in itself, so much as it's saying Nixon and the right's use of religion in that time was to say, oh, no, just look over here and don't really worry about all that. I mean, it's a very Marxist view anyway of religion, of saying, oh yeah, you just don't worry about that and you'll do. But as you can hear in the movie, it's literally it's so tragic and sad, it's literally hilarious. What the thing actually says is literally like, yes, excellent, can you be more specific? And very like vague.
Well, also suggest that it's a tool of surveillance to obviously see what are you really thinking about, and how can we use this against you, or use this as a form of control. And again, the electronic, almost AI nature of the voice in of itself is something that is a statement.
And then literally it's like statement that it gives him in response is just work harder, increase production. Like, and it's literally just saying we should be happy that we have a job. Like, literally, and
total capitalist.
And there's literally
the Church of Capitalism.
There's that great moment where he literally he's hearing this and he literally opens the door and like looks out.
And he's kind of tapping out.
And he's literally
and
just like what the hell is this? I think that's a very important aspect to the movie that is very more complex, especially in relation to, I think, Lucas's views than many would give it credit for, or that we should even, I think of religion as. Like anything else, it's like anything else that can be used for good or evil. It depends on the way you want to go about that, And
in some ways, the movies, as we talked about with the ending, the movie's biggest religious statement is to reject society, believe in yourself, be your own person. And as much as that might sound like an objectivist Ayn Rand idea, I don't feel like it comes across in that way, because it's basically saying that society is using all these tools to keep you down, and you need to rebel and be your own person. Now, not even in a clear, direct, obvious way that I think the movie's narrative is saying, but even in your own day-to-day life.
Of being it's what we laugh when people say this, but being the difference in what you see in the world, of saying, I'm going to be compassionate or kind or doing whatever, that is seen as a difference, not necessarily that you're not going to be Christian, even that because that is what I think Christianity is to reject the society of the world, which is, like we have said, empty and shallow and savage and violent in all ways, and disgusting and greedy and immoral. Do I need to add anything else? But and that is what this is too. That is often, and then Christianity being taken and used as a way to perpetuate that also, in very subtle forms, and so. Anyway, of course, we're going to talk about it that way from our Christian point of view, but that's, I think, what the movie is
about. But like we said, I'm glad that the Force, later on in his life,
is finding a peacefulness in the inner self of religion.
But then, with the prequels, he then went back to critique the instruments of the Force that could be used for complacency, for societal...
Well, also being as being as directly Christian in the sense of immaculate conception, and even that idea of being tempted to use one's power for evil, in the sense of like taking the devil's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, but blowing that up into like a whole bigger thing and saying, well, that person actually did lead down that path, and only has redemption by the end of the original movies in that sense.
And you know, one of the greatest scenes in all of Star Wars, I would say probably in the original movie especially, is the scene of, you know, that's the scene of all the Grand Moff sitting there and Vader's in there, and
Wars, yeah.
he, and you know, this whole idea that Obi-Wan's out there and the Force lives on, and that basically there's a Grand Moff that's like, you know, your ancient religion has no meaning, that the Empire has basically rid the galaxy of any semblance of that, and then how Vader suddenly reasserts the Force in that scene, almost you know, because we're talking about the Force in very rosy terms, but how the Force can also be used as you know, a hateful, powerful thing that can be used to enslave people.
Right, and you can look at that even away from the sense of it as a religious idea so much as an inner self or an inner motivation and a inner peace in the sense of another negative sense, which is to be so motivated and so inward that you can use violence as or motivation as a tool for violence in its own way that other people are not going to see as that. Or even just using religion in a negative sense, even too. But yeah, isn't it fascinating that it took a movie like this in that New Hollywood context and as sci-fi to actually make statements like this, that couldn't have already been the case? I mean, obviously you've seen that with, I don't really know what 2001's about, so I'm going to kind of put that to the side, but like even Planet of the Apes, for example, being about more of a civil rights or societal issue, not like a literal application of what is it like to be a human in the modern age of society, which is trying to drug us into complacency and to literally suck us dry in ways that the Matrix would also literally apply in the 90s. But yeah.
You mentioned earlier that Lucas has toyed around with this movie as he has his,
and it's not as big of a way as Star Wars has been, but
have there been many re-edits or anything of American Graffiti?
None of what I'm aware, only in the sense of it doesn't need it. I mean, none of these movies need it, but in his mind, I'm sure he looks at these, his science fiction films and thinks, oh, I can update the technology, because he's technology-minded, right? So, but in the sense of, there's, from what I'm aware, none whatsoever of American Graffiti in any term of a change.
What are some of the biggest updates in this movie? I think some of them are involving those like monster mutant people, right? Yeah,
that's a big thing, is making those look a little more inhuman or unrealistic.
And one of the funniest things to come out of this movie was like when the Warner Brothers executives saw it, they said, "Well, put the freaks up front," like
because that was at the very end of the movie, right?
And I guess that they were thinking about the context of all these other movies that were of this time and thinking we need this to be kind of more of a creature feature thing, and like, or you know, having these weird things that we can maybe turn into, obviously action figures weren't as big as they are now, but like maybe more immediately market this as.
Yes.
And he used
because that's what's in the trailer.
And he's used that as the rest of his career for why studio executives are intellectually brain dead.
Well, and even I feel like the movie is making the statement of that before we even talk about that. Like, the movie's making a statement out of the presence of those animals or creatures by literally saying, hey, like, that these things are ultimately like hippies or what.
Well, I was going to say, I guess they're in their own way versions of people that are trying to be outside of the society that, and this is what's become of them.
Right,
and like a cautionary tale to people there to not leave what they're part of.
And even that, I don't even think this, but even that could be manufactured by the state in its own way, right? Yeah. And so that, because there's a lot of theories about the CIA's like use of hippie culture, the counterculture, and a lot of ideas about that which are not totally known, but of whether that's even valid or not as a idea. That's almost like him saying this is what the state or the government views as the counterculture, right? As these weird, freakish entities that literally will rob and kill and steal things.
They're operating purely on base instinct,
right? And then the movie's almost saying, but you can be different even than that. Like, you don't have to even be. And him even making a statement on hippie culture of saying even this has fallen into this disrepair that you can be something else, and that's a very new left idea, right? Because I mean, The New Left, I think, always kind of stands off to the side from the regular counterculture by saying,
a little earlier,
of being like, no, but let's actually be clean cut about this. Let's not be this kind of like rabble that
Students
ultimately
for Democratic Society,
right that
SDS,
and
yeah.
like David, the guy who wore the suits all the time. He was a big protester that was in the trials of Chicago 7, and he was also at I think he was at the Pentagon when they did the March on the Pentagon, I'm pretty sure. David something. I can't remember his name. But he always wore suits and everything. He always looked a lot more put together.
Well, there's Tom Hayden, who is the leader of the SDS.
That's who it is, I think, is Tom Hayden is who I'm thinking of. Well, find a picture of him there and see. Yes, go back. There's another guy there, though, too, I think. No. David Dellinger, yeah.
Yeah, he was a lot more clean cut. Yeah.
That he was a person that was had been part of like the 50s and 60s protests, who was part of the New Left in the sense of seeing that I don't have to be this like hippie or wear all this stuff. I can just literally be, I have these ideas and I'm going to say them in the way that I want to. Staunton Lind was another version of that too, at that time, of somebody who was more clean cut version of that. Or as the band Fear once screamed, I'm so clean cut, I just want to blank some blank.
Thing about I
anyway.
always forget about Tom Hayden is that he was married to Jane Fonda for a time.
He looks like Bob Dylan meets Griffin Dunn or something. Look at him like
he does.
But
he passed away back in 2016.
Yeah, but anyway, this is all just to say that going back to so back to the idea that main things that they changed in this movie were some of the effects of the nuclear reactor stuff in the movie, as well as there was that random car chase they had where they had to make it look all like, it's big, and it's like, the grand thing about this movie, I think, is that it feels big, but it feels very unlifelike, and that's kind of the whole point of the movie, that I feel like he kind of upends with that, but it doesn't ruin the movie, but it's just like something stupid about it. It's like whatever, but
I guess maybe to wrap up our talk about this movie, what does the legacy of this hold, do you think, kind of in the context of either Lucas's career, New Hollywood, sci-fi, something else?
Well, especially proof that one of the most literally the richest celebrity in the world, right, made something like this. That this is what is within the artistic mode, right? Yeah. In so many ways, is that this is really where some people live in their mind space.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not even mean that in a negative way, but this is what they want.
Yeah.
And what they view the world as. And I'm sure he's a different person from that. I mean, it's an angry young man's version of such a
50
thing.
years
right?
ago,
I mean,
of course it's not going to be
and
the
of
same.
course, another thing about New Hollywood is all that coming out of the Beats and Jack Kerouac and On the Road and Big Sur and like all these ideas of traveling around. I mean, I feel like Five Easy Pieces is even more of an exemplification of like beat America than it is like French or German or English
that I have
cinema.
This prodigy background, but I'm going to run away and be a
and this
worker.
Transitory state of America that you could do that there and you could become whatever you wanted to be.
My own privilege.
Right, and that being a very American idea, even more than a European idea. And so I feel like there's a version of that also in this, of like self-discovery and self-worth in the midst of an incredibly oppressive society, and that, like you said, it's reflective of today and our own future, but it's also literally what it was then, and their view of how pharmaceuticals and television and religion were being used as this opiate and law enforcement to keep everything in law and order, in quotes, whereas everyone felt, why can't we do whatever we want to do? I mean, literally, and that was done in this form is really kind of what movies is all about, and why there should be more bracing and probing versions of popular cinema that obviously are impossible now. So, and were barely possible then.
This might sound reductive, and I mean this with all due respect, because I think in the arc of this, it's actually paying the movie a lot of respect. I think this movie will ultimately always be a footnote in the life and career of George Lucas, because of how overwhelmingly successful Star Wars is, to a lesser extent American Graffiti is, but with hope in that comes, as long as Lucas is going to be talked about as a cultural figure, which I think is going to extend several hundred years from now, perhaps thousands of years from now, who knows. As long as he will be remembered as an artist, there will always be the footnote of this movie. And there's always going to be this little dark door that people are going to decide to go down and get a vision of what this is. And so this movie, just by virtue of that, will always be something that's going to live on because it's part of his life and career.
Just that statement, the future is here, in itself is so cynical and so dark of what this is. Yeah, like you said, that I think is so resounding. It's from the very beginning you get the sense of, oh wow, this is this. And
because I think if you put it in context of a lot of these sci-fi movies, I think it's superior to a great many of them. But it's not going to be something that people rewatch as many times.
Unless you're like us and we're just sickos.
If you look at it in the context of New Hollywood, how can this stack up to The Godfather, The Graduate, Apocalypse Now,
Nashville, or whatever,
Jaws, you name them. Like, of course,
Chinatown, whatever.
It's not going to be quite as iconic as those. You look at it even in context of Lucas's, which again, as I said, is ultimately I think where it's going to reside. It's not Star Wars. It's not even American Graffiti. It's not these things, but it will always be a little footnote that is going to forever be preserved thanks to Lucas's life and legacy and career. And so that alone is going to make it this nasty little video nasty for future generations of people to go back
as
and go.
The British would say,
Because for so many people, it's going to be, it's the thing one of the things he did before Star Wars.
What's that? I like to see it, and then they're like, Donald Pleasance in the movie.
Yeah, because that's to say nothing of the movie's excellence, because I think it is brilliant, but it's just a square peg trying to fit in a lot of round holes, and I just think that that alone is gonna slip through the cracks. But because of its inherent proximity to Lucas, it's always now going to be something that's going to be remembered and preserved as it should be.
Yeah, to leave it on this, I think, because we haven't talked about the acting of the movie, which I think is good because that's kind of the point of the movie, is that's pretty unmemorable in the sense of the whole point of the movie is that these are not real people, right?
Even less so than his other movies, because some of his actors of his other movies have went as far as to slightly criticize him in terms of the way he tries to direct and the way he writes dialogue is not something that's all that brilliant. And they've kind of, but he literally also at the same time birthed the careers of young Ron Howard, young Richard Dreyfuss, of Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill. I mean, people that have gone on to be these iconic people. Somebody like Duvall, to mention him, I think I might have said this last time. I think the more and more I think about it, he might have one of the best filmographies in the history of Hollywood. And
the best performances in those films. Because you can talk about Samuel L. Jackson as just like being in everything, but it's like, but what do you really add to most of that in the sense of like, and he has some great performances.
I think obviously Tarantino's the biggest thing you're going to always
and Spike Lee with, and I mean, so he's had a lot of greatness, but yeah, for somebody to actually be in so many things and be great, I mean, it's got to be Robert Duvall.
I mean, he's even in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That one scene where he's like dressed like a priest and he's like on the swing. You remember that?
Talking about in the 70s one?
The 70s one. He's like, doesn't have any lines, I don't think. But he just
I forgot about that.
You get a good look at that's who it is. Yeah. And it's like totally. And it's like, what were you doing? Literally hanging out on set, and they're like, hey. Just get in this scene
being
here.
A Philip Kaufman movie too, and that kind of slight connection to Lucas in that way, there's something going on there.
But anyways, I mean, his very first movie
that movie's
was
in San Francisco too. Buratti
is Buratti in
Kill
Mockingbird, and I mean he's
Mock.
Yeah, but I remember we've talked about it before. But him and Widows, like I remember seeing the scene where him and Colin Farrell are getting into it, and I just being like, if you had a camera on my face, you would just see me smiling because I was like, oh my god, this might be his very last freak out. And somebody who we rewatch the scene from Network all the time of him flipping out in that.
I have a big titted hit. Yeah.
But I remember just seeing him in Widows and going, oh my god, this might be his last big blow up, and it's as good as it's ever been.
And I love that ends with him like, maybe it'd be better if you're not around. Colin Farrell says, and he's like, you finished? Like, but yeah, to say about this, we didn't even talk about Donald Pleasance. What a weird place in this movie.
Also got.
He's also one of those, that you could say that with. But there's the whole scene where
he's almost like the truth teller, the guy who knows that is trying to lead some sort of a resistance.
So
basically.
Strange. But yeah, that he's like, I want to be your roommate, and he's like,
he's so
wow.
creepy. Yeah,
and he's like, and I love that scene where he runs out and he's like, we can be happy. That feels that's the whole movie is really about that, of like happiness, like, and how that's like creepy and otherwise perverse and you know, just neutered by the weirdness of all this, is like such a strange presence in the movie. But anyway,
Donald Presence.
Pleasance. He's not very pleasant in this.
We watched this on a Blu-ray you had, right?
It's an English Blu-ray. It's a Region A though. Pretty great transfer. But yeah, obviously this movie's kind of weird in the sense of its release. But yeah.
So check it out if you have a chance. It might be streaming somewhere, but I don't know.
I have no idea.
The Ninth Circle of Hell.
I'm not even going to look that up. But yeah.
That's it for THX 1138. But up next, here is the trailer for 2020's Possessor.
You have a very special nature. One we've worked hard together to unlock. Pull me out. The results are normal. Anything you want to flag?
No, I'm fine.
Mom! Hi, darling.
How was your trip?
Dull. Extraordinarily dull.
Our next contract's a big one. The target is the CEO of the largest operation in the U.S. He'll be binding to Colin Tate. We can't afford any mistakes on this one.
Ready?
What's with you today?
What do you mean? I'm in place. Can we help you?
Finish this.
What are you doing? I can't pull the trigger. I need to know. I need to know what she's done to me.
It's become a danger.
Where is she? Come out or I'll do it!
Sometimes that small thought is all it takes to lose control.
So as we said, Possessor, much more conventional movie in a great many ways.
Just interesting to ever say that about.
I know,
movie.
because to see this movie in isolation, it's pretty extreme. But Possessor, 2020 sci-fi psychological horror film, written and directed by horror film, written and directed by Brandon Cronenberg. Yes, you heard it, son of David Cronenberg.
Never mind.
I think he'd only made one other movie before this, called Antiviral.
Yeah.
Came out back in like 2012, 2013.
So that's like Ricochet, because he doesn't want Logan Paul to go viral.
So this is his second movie, and Infinity Pool's his third movie. Came out last year. We talked about that on the pod. This stars Andrea Riseborough and Christopher Abbott. Also with Rosef Sutherland, Tuppence Middleton, strange name, Sean Bean, and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Riseborough portrays an assassin who performs her assignments through the possessing of the bodies of other individuals, but finds herself fighting to control the body of her current host, who's played by Abbott. The movie grossed $901,000. It didn't say what the budget was. It couldn't have been all that big.
Of course, you have to remember why that is.
You're right. So it premiered at Sundance in January of 2020. That was obviously right before COVID was going to upend everything. It got released in the U.S. and Canada, the extent that it was, in October of 2020 by Neon. It got good reviews, and I think, there's a lot of things that kind of just took a mulligan during the COVID era, and a lot of the studios just kind of shrugged and said, well, it wasn't quite as successful as it would have been, and, as we know, we're still dealing with the post-COVID kind of fallout from everything.
Right.
The easy comparisons and talk about this could go to talking about it being Brandon Cronenberg, and obviously its relationship to his dad, cinema, David Cronenberg, who of course has a legendary career in a great many ways. It's definitely body horror in the same way that a lot of Cronenberg movies. It's definitely sci-fi. I guess that's the place to start with this, Levi. What is David Cronenberg's cinema? And
You
to
mean
what
Brandon Cronenberg?
Oh, excuse me, yes. See, I'm going to get mixed up too. Brandon Cronenberg's cinema, and to what extent does it relate to his father's? I mean, how do you see it in relation to his?
Well,
because it would almost be easier to talk about if they were two distinct, different things. Like, say, Sofia Coppola's movies versus Francis Ford Coppola's. I mean, they're both really great directors in their own way and have these big kind of differences. Yeah. And so it's easier to separate them. But when you look at these two, it almost kind of feels like the next generation of a certain kind of movie, literally and figuratively. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a very clear body horror aesthetic to all his movies so far, right, that we've seen. I mean, this and Infinity Pool. Right, of being about, and both of these movies in a lot of ways, but being very like Frankenheimer's seconds, It's not exactly the body horror of his father's films in the sense of, like, somebody's body literally being destroyed by this parasite or this, like, scientific thing gone wrong, like, it's that... They're both kind of questioning, like, what if one's consciousness is in another place? Right, or trying to be someone else, or trying to change body, or body swaps, or whatever, right? I mean, so that is different. Obviously, though, also I find his movies to be their violence is to a whole other level than his father's films, which are a lot more physical and bracing in ways that are more typically not like like Videodrome of like putting your head through a TV or like reaching into your own body to pull out a VHS tape. Like, it's not like that kind of version of body horror or even Crash, like, as it is just people literally being ripped apart or destroyed. There were several instances of violence in this movie. We started laughing because in another movie it would like not show it. It would be more subtle, but this movie, it's like every time that you're going to see something violent, you're going to see literally the only time that violence is not shown is when it happens to a child in this movie. Right. Yeah. It's not one of the few moments where we don't see it. Everything else, it's like, yes, you are going to see somebody get shot in the head, or you are going to see somebody literally get a poker slammed through their mouth, and, they're alive, by the way. Oh, yeah. Like, we were, what? Yeah, we were like, because I think you had joked, like, he's definitely dead. Yeah. And then later on, which it clearly looked like that was the case, and then later on it was like, he's actually still alive. In critical condition, like... Yeah, I'd call that condition critical, definitely. But yeah, just of it taking a more direct look at the violence rather than this like cool, more detached, like, these things happen and nobody's perfect kind of thing. Yeah. Well, y'all aren't going to get that, but whatever. The Godfather of the Game reference. But in this being like, no, we are going to show it, and these are real people who are being murdered or being destroyed, like, and taking a more direct emotional attachment to it almost, which is strange because it's even more violent, I feel like, than his own father's work. But it does feel like, even despite that, like you were saying, it's this more about the consciousness almost than the and seeing the body as useless transformation. Than physical transformations from man to fly or man into like I just watched Shivers recently just before this. It's a pretty good movie, but I won't really go into that. That I have a lot of different ideas about. But literally like a parasite making someone into a sexual maniac, like, and like, there being a difference in more about the consciousness and the self, rather than the physical being the primary gauge of one's worth. So to get a little bit more into the details of what this is, so as you said, it's set in an alternate 2008 for whatever reason. So Andrea Riseborough, she's an assassin who doesn't look like a conventional assassin. I guess that's because, well, actually she's going into other people's bodies, and she basically, is... And I like that the movie doesn't get too lost in the how or the why of this exactly, other than in the context of the tension of will we be able to get her back out of this, or is she going to die in the Abbott's body? That I like that it doesn't get lost too much in the details, that it's more about psychologically what happens if a person's mind is literally fighting a battle in someone else's mind and body. And I didn't quite expect that was exactly going to be the direction that the story took, that was going to be like a tension in it. But I really liked that it was, because I thought that was an interesting little dynamic into a kind of a body swap movie.
Yeah.
Is what happens when one's mind is in someone else's mind and body, and they're kind of grappling for control of this. And the desperation she feels of, well, I just want to like get out of this and get back to my utterly unlikable husband and child. And then that mind that's been possessed, literally having to say, well, wait a second, well, now I have to live with this, and I'm not going to let you do that. And like, obviously for what has happened, like, and it's interesting too, because Abbott is effectively really the lead of the movie, because he's in way more scenes.
Well, it's like seconds in that way, where like really it's the person within that's the character, but we're seeing it through that person, right? So... And
it is interesting to see, like, Abbott play this in a way where he's performing for everyone else and also concealing who he really is, hypothetically being her, you know what I mean, in the midst of all this. And I would say, like... I'd say this about this movie and Infinity Pool. I don't think these movies are all that deep.
No.
But I think they're really well made.
Yeah.
And I think Brandon Cronenberg has a lot of like potential to be a director that whenever he makes a movie, I'm like, ooh, I want to see that. Because I've quite liked both of these, even more so Infinity Pool. Because they both, and I might have mentioned this last time, they both feel like these weird, dark, dirty paperbacks you find that are meant to be just kind of sleazy and like these page turners. But while they're not very deep, they do have some interesting little ideas. I feel like Infinity Pool is even more literary in its sensibilities than this is, because this is a more straightforward assassin killing people, and it's like not really getting into that how or why. It's more, like you said, of kind of a thriller. But again, I really do like both of these movies, because I feel like he shows a lot of potential to be this new little genre director who, he's always going to very likely be compared to his father, but he has the potential to be his own little voice and his own, things to say. What do you kind of take away from this movie in its relation to Infinity Pool, what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with that, it's a lot more complex about the ideas of the rich and kind of the rich being, immune from prosecution over violence or that, what do you call it, affluenza is an idea, right? And like, that's a lot more complex. What I liked about this, other than stylistically, it had a propulsion that I felt that film sometimes lacked. And I liked that movie. I didn't like it as much as you did, the sense that it that movie is kind of has these stops and starts, and then it becomes about, well, who are they actually them? And that's all good. But
and there's a whole bit of deception with My Golf's character.
Right.
And that kind of throws everything for a loop. I do feel like this movie lacked a clear antagonist. It's obviously... It's this, will she get out or not within Abbott's body? That's its own sense of antagonism. But My Golf, I think, she's a little bit of a divisive figure in modern movies, which I think is actually interesting. But I think she just plays, she knows how to put her pitch, literally vocally, but also with her expression.
She's the Sharon Stone or Faye Dunaway.
I think that there's a lot of comparisons you could make to that. That she just knows how to ratchet it up in movies in a way there's no really anybody else that's doing that right now. And so
to
I
get
think,
under your skin and aggravate you, but also be like
kind of terrified of them, but also annoyed at the same time, which is a very rare quality. And so I just really think this movie kind of lacks that kind of quality.
That makes it a little more interesting, though, too, is that you're like, well, who's actually the villain here? Because it's clear that this Christopher Abbott character is a total worthless a-hole.
Right.
But also you're like, Yeah, but he's a person. I mean,
who's
like,
literally being violated,
right?
Yeah,
and being forced to kill people he's in love with, supposedly.
Yeah.
But yeah. In very violent ways.
Well, that just like who are we even rooting for in the film's final moments? I don't even know exactly.
And then there's a child who's possessed by another person, and it's like, well, I guess that's the ultimate villain of the movie is Jennifer Jason Leigh. In a way,
I guess,
like,
yeah.
But she's not in it a whole lot either, so it's like whatever. But yeah.
She was unexpected. I wasn't expecting her to be in this. It was like, oh, okay, you're in this now.
Yeah.
What do you think this has to say about, I guess, like, because I think you'd written down here the kind of the body horror sci-fi, but also the corpo thriller.
Yeah.
That is definitely a whole, like, little very small subgenre that something like Inception comes to mind with a little bit. That's obviously an incredibly accomplished sci-fi action movie also.
Yeah, that, like, it seems like in science fiction in general, it's become so much more about corporations as
warring
villains.
For control, yeah.
Right, and that being, like, whether it be in the form of Dune in that way, or Blade Runner, or even action movies now, or action video games like Hitman, or even Cyberpunk. I mean, Cyberpunk 2077 is literally all about all these various corporations that are fighting for control over the city, and them actually being literally corpo states, like that the states themselves are owned by the corporations, and that the police is kind of in some way at least influenced by the corporations, and like operating within that space, like you know, and the military contractors being run by corporations and that sort of thing. But
yeah, and I think that like war between corporations is something that people who are starting to like actually understand how society works now are like, that's actually the real wars that are going on. Less so sometimes even between real nations than behind these corporate forces at work.
There are no nations. There are no peoples. Yeah.
We mentioned it earlier, but this being a COVID casualty, I feel like in an alternate world, this could have been a little bit more of a bigger hit that kind of broke through a little bit more.
A big fat, big hit.
But being what it is, I mean, I'm sure it's probably been successful enough on streaming or VOD or however it's found its way into it. But, thinking about another, obviously it's far bigger, to mention Christopher Nolan again, but something like Tenet, that was obviously a huge casualty of COVID. It was set to be released.
That's also pretty much a corpo thriller in its own ways, too. But
yeah, I mean, he's made
we saw how sunscreen saved the world, I mean. It's literally the most random thing ever.
I don't know how Infinity Pool did exactly financially.
Probably not that great, I would assume, but...
I think it is good that he at least got another chance to do. It said it made $5.2 million. I don't know what its budget would have been. Probably not
around that or a little
high. More. That did have an 86%. Something here that it's on the Wikipedia page. It says Katie Walsh, critic for the LA Times, wrote that comparing it to Possessor, Infinity Pool is, quote, larger in scope than its predecessor. The narrative grander, sharper, funnier, more wickedly perverse. That is true. I feel like Infinity Pool operates on a slightly more dark comic level than this does. Where was this movie made, actually? I'm just curious about.
Yeah, I have no idea.
The production happened. If I had to guess, Canada. Yeah, it was in Canada. Ontario. It just, by the way, the last sentence or two of the Wikipedia page for Possessor says, in another debriefing, Voss sorts through her personal objects again. She contemplates and recognizes the butterfly, but cannot express any guilt for killing it. Gerder smiles and replies, very good. This movie does have, obviously, a very dark sensibility.
Yeah.
Hardly any of the redemptive quality exactly of even something, as we said, like THX 1138, which unexpectedly has that. We can maybe wrap up here. Again, we knew we weren't going to have quite as much to talk about with Possessor as we did THX. You did right here on our kind of outline humanism. What comes to mind to you when it comes to the humanism of this movie?
I think it's just the fact that, actually, and I mean, I'm not saying that other science fiction movies don't talk about these things, because obviously, I mean, the whole point of THX 1138 is about the inhumanity of modern society and modern technology, right? But I don't know, I felt like with making this character have a family and even ex-husband or like separated husband who's like a total piece of trash, by the way.
That's what I said. He's like totally awful,
right? And it's like, but she cares about him and the child, and you don't normally see exactly about that. An
assassin kind of character.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a version of that with literally The Killer, that Fincher movie that came out, and like him, I'm in love with this woman. And it's like, but it feels very like prescribed, and like, whatever, I guess he has a attachment in the world, it's like very basic, whatever, like, and part of that's due to the Fassbender's performance is very, opaque and kind of cold and whatever, but
do you think this is added for this movie because it's a quote woman and we don't see a lot of women assassin movies?
Yeah, I think that could be that, but also what's strange is you see that not only but you also see that even within the Abbott character of her even wanting maybe to even, I mean, obviously she doesn't really care about these people, but him being nicer and the fiance being like, you seem different, what's going on? And like the sadness of that, of like her being kind by nature of wanting to even be with a family is like making this evil person seem sweeter than that. And like that's such a complex kind of idea that I think most sci-fi movies don't even care to even like approach, because sci-fi usually is this very cold, like, I was a person but now I am not, like kind of thing, and like her still wanting to even be a person in the midst of all this.
So I guess that is some glimmer of hope against the bloodshed.
Well, now of course the ending is like, well, all that's been taken away and now it doesn't matter anymore. So I mean, in that way it's very conventional, but even the fact
I do feel like you do need some glimmer of some of that. Otherwise, you're just watching people kill people, and it's like, why do I care?
Kind of like what The Killer was ultimately, which is a good enough movie, but it's like, okay, whatever, I don't care. Like, David Fincher, why are you even making things anymore? Question mark.
Him and Steven Soderbergh should get in like to a director off of like who,
or just a street
like who
fight,
wants to like,
and just see whoever leaves.
Yeah, just ends up being that they live fight in the alley.
Yeah, and whoever lives can't make movies anymore. Basically, like,
I do actually want to go on a run and watch a lot of these random Soderbergh movies, especially that have just come out, and I'm sure there's some actually. I heard some better things about
that new one he made that
came
out Sundance.
That too, but as far as just even things that have been, let me look here real quick. Back from right after the Che days, basically. On his Wikipedia page, the picture. No Sudden Move.
Yeah, I
heard that was good. Has a pretty good cast in it. Presence is the name of his new one. Yet again, Neon. That's maybe another place to end this.
Yeah.
We talked about Neon recently. It might have just been us talking. I don't even know if it was on the pod.
No, it was us. Yeah.
That Neon is kind of representing an alternative to A24, because A24's definitely... No, I think we maybe did talk about Neon a little bit with Honora, maybe. Maybe that was just us. I can't remember now. Anyways, Neon's kind of an A24 alternative. They've won the last, 5 Palme d'Ors, I believe?
Yeah, I think so.
Movies that they've picked up or had some part of. Especially in horror. They've been doing a lot of horror-related stuff recently. The new Soderbergh movie, Presence, a family discovers they're not alone when they move into a new house. What I've heard is it's basically a horror movie that's all told from the perspective of the ghost, which I think is a really interesting idea. The new movie's only 85 minutes also. Lucy Liu and Julia Fox are both in it. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah.
We'll probably, if we see it, we'll definitely be talking about it on here. Any other thoughts about Possessor before we wrap it up today?
No, not particularly. Just very...
It's just a naturally, when we're talking about this in THX, it's a more shallow movie in a lot of ways, but it's still a lot of fun, and I think sets up
good fun.
Brandon Cronenberg as someone to pay attention to.
Yeah, great genre movie in that sense, I think, and it gives
not
me
quite
hope
as
to continue to see
transformative in the way
movies
that THX is, obviously, but I agree. That does it for the 92nd episode of Overlapping Dialogue. But Jeff
better turn on that siren. Everybody back away, because we got a disaster coming on right here.
2 of them.
2 of them.
Yeah.
Twins! We got twins! Literally,
what have we got next time?
Stay tuned for scenes from our next episode.
You're talking just exactly like they were. Every one of them who loved these medals, and then they cheered my court-martial. Do you understand what I went through, huh?
Do you know that I was months a prisoner of war? Do you know that I was months in solitary confinement in a little 4x4 bamboo cell? 367 days, 6 years they held me as a prisoner of war. And then I came back here. And my life was hell back here because she took it away from me. Every single one of them took it away from me. All those guys, too. Yeah, I see them every Sunday. I see them from up there, down in the mass. Their little upturned faces and their two little weenies in a Coke, watching the big game, cheering the big game. Because they cheer all the good things. They cheer the big game and they cheer court-martials. And they love the big event because it makes them feel big, and I was gonna give it to them big. They'd have been talking about that goddamn game for the next 5,000 years. And so would Margaret, and so would the kids.
Margaret and the kids, and don't give a damn about Margaret and the kids.
Please, don't leave me, don't leave me. I loved her. My last Christmas in captivity. They allowed me one letter from Margaret, and in it was a photograph of Margaret and the kids standing in front of the house. And the shadow of the person that took the picture was in the foreground, and it was wide, and it fell on their legs. And all I could think about was who took the picture. I spent more time looking at the shadow than I did at my own wife or kids.
Got it. You've got to get further ahead of it.
I know what I'm doing.
Cut across the field, Bill.
I know I have to get ahead of it.
You're gonna have to get into that field.
Do you want to drive?
I'm just saying.
Would you like to drive?
Yes, I'd love to.
This is 3 miles southeast. Let's see what she does.
Go in there. Go in there. Hurry. You're gonna miss it.
Hold on. Just hold on a second.
Have you lost your nerve?
Tighten your seatbelt.
Bill, Joe, where are you? We lost visual.
Are we having fun yet?
Okay, we gotta get out of this.
Really?
2 miles now. Picking up speed.
Bill, sometime this week would be good.
I'm trying to get out.
Are you mad?
I'll be mad later. Right now I'm trying not to kill us.
Funnel getting thicker.
gone. It's gone.
Where's my truck? There it is.
You just heard the trailers.
I honestly don't know which of those is a better scene. No, not trailers. We heard scenes. Yes.
I keep making that mistake.
Yeah.
Scenes from
We're not cutting this out.
Black Sunday from 1977 and Twister from 1996.
Yeah, I don't know which is the better scene. I don't know. Like, it's tough.
Okay, so I think for me, slightly Black Sunday, although I do love Twister.
Writing,
I've only seen Black Sunday once. It's, of course, a disaster movie from John Frankenheimer.
It's a disaster. Yeah, but...
You know, and I know you've liked him for a long time, and I've always liked him. The more and more I look at and think about Frankenheimer's career, the more I just think more of it, of like, wow, what a fascinating group of movies he did, as far as someone who always evolved with the time. And I think most of us would agree his apex was like the 60s, but he made in every era, he made
Manchurian Candidate,
Seconds,
7 Days of May and Seconds, all right there together is just like, wow. Like, you know.
Then even, we were even talking about recently Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah, of course, that comes right in the middle of those, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's just like flawless right there. It's like, yeah.
We've still not seen The Train.
No, but I've always heard really good things about that, too.
But,
I mean, his work with Burt Lancaster has always been great. But.
So, anyways, when I remember seeing this for the first time, it just checked literally every box I pretty much want out of a movie. The Backriders, presumably, will be the same thing. But it's just like
Robert Shaw versus
action,
Bruce
thriller,
Dern, like,
disaster movie, football,
Israeli-Palestinian nonsense.
Israeli-Palestinian, the after effects of Vietnam War, as you said, Bruce Dern.
You mean the war?
The war? Robert Shaw. I mean, it's literally just like everything you want.
There's that scene where they're in Miami where like Robert Shaw's running on a beach with the biggest revolver of all time, and it's literally like, this is cinema. Like,
But I remember at the time, and I'll be curious to revisit it. I'm sure my opinion is not going to change very much, but I remember thinking like, this is like, I mean, I've seen quote B movies that are like better than this, but this was also around the time where B movies with Jaws and Star Wars, as we know, were getting bigger budgets, and I thought this is kind of a thing that gets forgotten about because it's kind of in a certain tradition of movie, of a B movie that got like a bigger budget, and it's just like, this goes to the heart of what a lot of great genre movies are, where they have this ripped from the headlines quality of who even wrote that movie? Let me just look it up real quick. But it just feels like it's a grab bag of so many things of that era. Actually, it was, let's see, Ernest Lehman, Kenneth Ross, and Ivan Moffat were three people.
Mary Ellen Moffat, she broke my heart.
Ivan Moffat, it says, wrote Giant, the screenplay for it anyways. Let's see, Ernest Lehman... Let's see, North by Northwest.
Oh,
there you go. Yeah. I mean,
what more do you want?
The Prize, that Paul Newman movie.
What the hell do you want from
the West Side Story. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? The Sound of Music. Wow, this guy had Family Plot, of course, the last Hitchcock movie. So wow, okay, he's a name to. I don't know if I really knew all that. I think I've seen that name around, but anyways.
Yeah.
Also playing off the whole like Munich massacre that would have happened in the 70s, early 70s. Also, this movie just not in a way that I don't even think exactly feels crass, but is like this rip from we're just going to jam pack all these crazy things going on around this time and turn it into something I think that's special and memorable.
Yeah.
Bruce Dern especially, I love him. Gives I think a great performance as a villain in this. Mark Keller kind of plays one of the villains also is in this. Produced by Robert Evans. I mean, literally one of the most 70s movies ever made.
Yeah.
You know, that can be said about a lot of things.
Oh, Robert Evans produced this?
Yeah.
Holy crap. Yeah, of course.
This is a Paramount release. Right. John Williams did the music. I mean, come on. This is it. This is one of the movies. What's your impressions of Black Sunday?
Just an incredibly rewatchable movie, and I've yet to even rewatch it. And I know that for a fact. So yeah, I mean that's going to be it's going to be good.
Wicked good.
It's going to be a good time. I mean, you think Good Time as a movie? I mean, the movie Good Time, of course, but this is just like and it's kind of long.
Yeah,
just like everything we want, you know.
Twister from 1996 is the other one we're going to be doing. As Levi said, might have been talking about it when we did the bonus episode recently.
Yeah,
you've not seen that yet.
No.
I've seen it maybe once or twice years ago. It's not a movie that I've seen all that often, but it is one of the classic '90s blockbusters. I mean, it's a lot of people remember like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park and Titanic and a lot of the big blockbusters of that era.
Right.
Twister easily is not as good as those, but it is still a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I forgot how much this movie. You know how much this movie made?
Twister?
Yeah.
Probably a lot, I would think.
$495 million in 1996.
That's crazy.
So it was 88 to 92 million, and it grossed $495 million. Came out in May of 96. I've got to look and see what the box office for that year was, because that was number 2 behind Independence Day. So that's another one that are obviously 90s disaster movies. This is a lot more grounded, obviously. Doesn't involve like a sci-fi kind of, explanation exactly. It's just a pure survival disaster movie. Just from afar, Levi, what do you expect Twister to be? Somebody who's not seen it.
Wicked good fun. I mean, literally, like, just from the scene that we watched this, I was literally like, yes, this is how you make... I mean, because from Jan de Bont, I said, directed Speed, and love Speed, just, love that movie.
And also shot, just some of the movies he shot, Roar, Cujo, Flesh and Blood, Die Hard, The Hunt for Red October,
Die Hard,
Lethal Weapon 3, and Basic Instinct.
So, yeah, he kind of, obviously, Basic Instinct. Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, having worked with John McTiernan, I mean, so many, great sense of action. So, yeah, I expect a lot from this, actually, because I know it's very beloved.
Some of that is nostalgia, but I do generally remember this to be a good movie, too.
Yeah.
I think also just it's starring Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton, 2 stars of that era.
Right.
Again, also produced and co-written by Michael Crichton. Right. Kathleen Kennedy also was a producer on this. I think Spielberg even was an executive producer. So, just, it's just got a lot of prestige, weirdly, for a movie that's obviously clearly just a blockbuster disaster kind of thriller film. So, looking forward to that. Like I said, I don't have a... Well, even, I was just scanning through this real quick. The production was plagued with problems. Joss Whedon, had... brought in to rewrite the script through the early spring when Whedon contracted bronchitis. Zellion was brought in to rewrite. So, I mean, this even more people are just falling out the closet that is this movie, when you look at it. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that double feature?
No, just that it'll be interesting because one of them is like what could be a very easily preventable situation in the sense of Black Sunday. And then something that is so obviously like
act of God,
right? Or and this big like just nature, right? And so I'll be interested to see how that applies. But
that about does it for this episode of Overlapping Dialogue. This is Kyle.
This is Levi.
Take care. God bless.
Thank you very much. So nice. Goodbye.